Hey guys, welcome back to Planet Mithril Paints. We're so happy to be back, and boy have we got a tutorial for you today. We're so excited to finally got round to painting Saruman the White on horse. Now we need to say this is a paint scheme that works both for the mounted version that we're painting today as well as the foot version as well. We have already got the Greenwood Wormtongue tutorial out, and as we're painting Isengard ourselves at the moment and have been putting off this model for quite a while, thought this was the best chance to finally get some paint on a truly amazing sculpt. As always, the model was trimmed off the sprue, cleaned of any flash and thoroughly mould line cleaned. These new plastic sculpts are generally pretty good when it comes to mould line cleaning, just making sure we got all of them off the main flatter areas of robes and horse musculature. The model was then assembled and affixed to the base using plastic glue, whereupon it was then undercoated with Mechanica Standard Grey. We opted for Mechanica Standard instead of Chaos Black this time around, as the tones we're working with are quite muted, quite pale, and would work better over a slightly lighter undercoat than it would a dark Chaos Black. We will be sanding the base a bit later on, but not until we get to the end of the video. We really hope you enjoy our first tutorial back. We've got some amazing content coming out for you guys, and we're kicking off strong with this menacing and conniving wizard. So without further ado, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Base colours. We're going to start with a mix of Bugman's Glow and Mechanica Standard Grey and base coat both the hands and the face. The Mechanicus Grey will help to reinforce that slightly drained, drawn and aged look we want our Saruman to have when we finish the highlight in the face later on. Now we can use a mix of Skaven Black Dinge and Administratum Grey and apply a base coat to the long flowing hair and his big wizardy beard. Being careful as well to pick out his eyebrows. Now we're going to use a mix of Wraithbone and a little bit of Rakarth flesh just to offset the tone, and apply this as a base coat to the entirety of the robes. This includes the outer robes, the inner robes, the boots, and any of the sleeves and cuffs. We're going to want to apply this in a couple of thin down layers to ensure we get a nice smooth consistent finish to the robes. If we can avoid any blemishing and blotches now at this stage, it's going to make the highlighting and layering stages so much easier. Now we're going to base coat the horse using a mix of Abaddon Black and Incubi Darkness. We want the tone of the horse's fur to be slightly off black, so the Incubi Darkness just helps to bring the tone up ever so subtly, whilst also providing that deep richness that we want. Finally, we're going to base coat the horse's hair with a mix of Abaddon Black and Skaven Black Dinge, about a 50-50 split. This will be dark enough to complement the hue of the horse's fur, but also light enough that the contrast between the two areas is very visible. Skin. We're going to start adding Cadian flesh tone to the previous base coat mix and apply an all over layer to the skin, leaving the deepest recesses still showing the base coat layer. The Mechanica Standard Grey will show through very subtly, and if you kept your percentage fairly minimal during the base coat stage, shouldn't overpower the rest of the highlighting stages. Now we're going to apply a wash of Reikland Flesh Shade thinned with a little bit of Lamia Medium, and apply this as an all over wash to the skin and hands, letting it sink into the deepest recesses, bringing a little bit of warmth back to Saruman. Now we're going to start layering up by adding more Cadian flesh tone to the previous layer mix, leaving the recesses still showing the Reikland Flesh Shade and base coat mix showing. We're going to focus on defining the brow line, defining his very pronounced cheekbones and nose, and creating a bit more of a skeletal look down his aged hands. Now we're going to start adding increments of Pallid Witch flesh just to further reinforce that long, drawn, drained look we want for Saruman, focusing on pronouncing even more areas such as the forehead and the brow lines and the cheekbones in particular, leaving the previous layers showing to create a nice transition between the darker and lighter areas of flesh tone. By the time you're finished with the highlighting stages, your mix should contain no more than about 50% Pallid Witch flesh and you should just be focusing on picking out the most raised details across the face and the hands. Once you're happy with how your skin looks, we're going to very carefully paint in the eye recesses with Abaddon Black. And then 2 pinprick dots of pallid witch flesh either side to create the irises. Hair and beard. Oh, and eyebrows. We're going to apply a manual shade to the beard and hair with a wash of Skaven Black Dinge, thinned down significantly with Lamia Medium. This will just sink into the recesses and provide some nice background shade. Now we're going to use Mechanica Standard Grey mixed with a small amount of pallid witch flesh, no more than 3 parts grey to 1 part pallid witch, and start working on picking out the most defined areas of hair. Now the mould for Saruman's hair is very fine and the hair follicles themselves are very tight together, so take your time, make sure you've got a good point to your brush to make sure you're as precise as you can be at this stage. The neater you can be here, the better the overall look will be once we're finished. Once you're happy with how your initial blocking of the hair detail looks, we're going to start working up the highlights now by adding increments of pallid witch flesh until you get to, again, about a 50-50 split between the pallid witch flesh and the Mechanica Standard Grey. At this point as well, we can start creating more definition over the eyebrows and the moustache and creating more of a flow in the detail and texture of the hair. For the final few highlight layers, we're going to start adding in small amounts of white scar to the previous Mechanicus and pallid witch flesh mix, pushing the highlights further and being as tight and neat as we can when it comes to highlighting, trying our best to leave the previous layer mixes showing towards the top of all the hair and focusing mainly on the ends and the tips of all the hair follicles. For a final edge highlight, we're going to add a bit more white scar, again to about a 50-50 mix to the previous layer mix, and just focus on the very most pronounced areas of hair. The very tips, the very outer curls, the very edges of the crown on his head, and the tips and edges of the moustache, beard and eyebrows. Robes. We're going to start applying some manual shades to all the robes and cloth on Saruman now by adding in a small amount of Baneblade Brown to the original Wraithbone and Rakhar flesh mix. Keep this as targeted as we can to really help create some depth and natural flow to all the cloth, as this is the biggest part of the model and arguably the crux of his overall appearance. Once you're happy with your initial shade, we're going to apply a very light wash of Reikland Flesh shade just over all the robes, just to tie together the shade and the base layer and soften the transition between the darker and lighter areas at this stage. Once you're happy with how your shading looks, we're going to start adding in Ushabti Bone to the Wraithbone and Rakhar Flesh mix and start blocking out the larger areas of cloth and material over the model. We're keeping the percentage of Ushabti Bone here fairly minimal so that we don't end up overwhelming the look of the robes. So this can be super time consuming and frustrating, but take your time. There is a lot of cloth on the model and it's important to get all the layers blocked in properly and correctly for a good natural sense of flow and movement across all the material. We're going to try and keep the Reikland Flesh shade and the base coat shade showing in the deepest recesses just to further help push that transition. With the cuffs in particular, work very carefully on blocking out all the individual filigree. Again, time consuming, but really worth the effort. By the time at which you've finished your blocking layers, your mix should contain no more than 50% ushabti bone and should look something like this. Now for the highlight stages, we're going to start adding in, you guessed it, pallid witch flesh. For somebody called Saruman the White, we're not actually using an awful lot of white on his robes. Contrast to Gandalf, his robes are a lot more beige, so we want to really focus on and push that aesthetic by choosing more of a muted, pastel-y palette, which I think complements this sculpt and ties in with the other areas on the model really nicely once we're finished. We're going to focus on pushing the block layers further by picking out the most raised details over the robes and just further reinforcing that sense of flow and movement across all the material. Keep adding in pallid witch flesh in as many increments as you want until you get to a 50-50 split of pallid witch flesh and the original layer mix. And by the time you're at the final highlight stage, you're looking at just defining the uppermost folds of all the material. Again, try and keep your brush strokes in as long, unbroken streaks as you can, with a nice tip to your brush to make sure all these highlights go where they want to go. Because the last thing you want to risk doing is undoing all the good work you've done at this point with the last highlight stage. Just picking out all the filigree with dot highlights to finish off the robes for our menacing wizard. Staff. We're now going to use Abaddon Black and carefully try not to bleed out onto the finished robes, base coat the staff he's holding in his left hand. And we can use a mix of Abaddon Black and Dark Reaper and just try and frame some of the outer areas of the staff that are facing the light. Mainly down the front of the staff, which is facing away from him, and picking out the crown on the top of the staff, which houses the orb. I'm going to apply a very quick edge highlight to the top of the staff just to define it a little bit more with pure Dark Reaper. Now our staff is done, we can use the three-stage process of Administratum Grey, Ulthuan Grey and White Scar and just pick out the orb in the top of the staff. Being careful again not to bleed out onto the finished black. Use Ulthuan Grey just to apply a quick mid layer. Followed by a quick dot highlight of White Scar just to make it glint that little bit more. Horse. As we did with the robes, we're going to apply a manual shade to the recessed musculature of the horse with pure Abaddon Black, thinned down with a little Lamia medium. Now we're going to start adding some deepkin flesh to the original Abaddon Black Inky by Darkness base mix and block out the main areas of musculature of the horse's frame, leaving the recessed shade showing in the deepest recesses and providing a little bit of tonal differentiation between the upper and lower areas on the horse's main body. It's also framing the ears and blocking out larger areas such as the rump and the neck. Increase the amount of deepkin flesh in the mix, so an approximate 50-50 split of deepkin and the original base coat mix, and just continue to frame more of the musculature, leaving the previous layers showing in the recesses. Again, providing a nice tonal shift between the more raised areas and more recessed areas of horse muscle. Now we're going to apply a mix with 50% pallid witch flesh and 50% the original Abaddon Incubi and Deepkin mix, and apply this as an edge highlight all over the horse, further defining and framing the horse's shape and muscle. These more muted tones like Deepkin and pallid witch flesh will bring up the tone of the horse's body much more naturally than if we were to try to add in any light greys at this point. It also really complements the addition of the Incubi darkness we put in to the original base coat mix. Now we're going to wash all the horse's hair and tail with non-oil. Now we're going to apply a relatively thorough dry brush of Skavenblight Dinge over all the horse hair, making sure the wash is dried beforehand. Keep this as targeted as you can do at this stage. We want to avoid bleeding out onto the finished horse body. We're going to follow this up with a very light dry brush over the top of the hair with pure Administratum Grey. Straps and metals. We're going to use a mix of Doomball Brown and Dryad Bark and carefully pick out all the straps, the bridle and the saddle over the whole model. And again, we're keeping a nice point to our brush. We can make sure this goes exactly where we need it to go and minimise any risk of bleeding out, particularly over the robes or the boots as we do the stirrups. We're now going to apply a very targeted light wash with Agrak Thirshade just to provide a little bit more depth to the leather of all the straps and belts. Finally, using pure Tuscarora fur, we're going to apply an extreme edge highlight just to frame the outer edges of all the straps. We're going to use Lead Belcher and Ironbreaker just to carefully pick out all the metal details on the horse, in particular the buckles and any of the metalwork along the bridle and reins. And give it a quick targeted wash with some non-oil just to dull it down that little bit. And with the Ironbreaker, apply a very quick dot highlight just to all these metals, just to make them pop that little bit more. Scenic base details. We're going to use a 4-stage paint method to paint the rocks on the base, starting with a thorough base coat of Dryad Bark just to pick up all the rocks and dirt sculpted underneath the horse. Followed by a thorough dry brush of Gawthor Brown over the top once this is dry. A second dry brush, this time lighter, with Baneblade Brown. Followed by a final, very light dry brush of Pallid Witch Flesh just to tie it all together. This will also tie in very nicely when we get round to painting the sanded base. We're going to use a progression of Caliban Green through to Warpstone Glow to paint the Rohirrim shield on the ground now. We're going to start by painting the wood panelling with pure Caliban Green, making sure to get both the reverse side and the inner. We're then going to apply a layer with a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Balor Brown, leaving the Caliban Green showing in the deepest recesses. followed by a thorough wash of BL Tan Green. Finally, we're going to add a small amount of Warpstone Glow to the Caliban and Baylor Brown layer mix and carefully pick out the individual wood grain. Now, using Lead Belcher, we're going to carefully pick out the inner workings of the Rohirrim helmet on the floor. And then give this a quick wash with some Nuln Oil. This won't need highlighting. Now we're going to use Sycorax Bronze and Canoptek Alloy just to work on the gold trim of the Rohirrim shield. Starting with Sycorax Bronze, pick out all the filigree of the shield. As well as the filigree and trim on the Rohirrim helmet and the headdress on the top. Once you're happy with this, apply a targeted wash with some Agrax Earthshade just to dull it down so it matches the tone of the base rubble. Then finally apply a very fine edge highlight of Canoptek Alloy just to finish framing all the gold detailing on the Scenic base. Base. Now that our wizard is painted and the base details are done, we can finally sand the base with fine modelling sand affixed with PVA glue. Once this is dry, we can go over with some watered down Abaddon Black just to tone it back, ready for the dry brushing stages. We'll start off with a very thorough dry brush of dryad bark just to get the underlying tones of earth and gravel in place, followed by a lighter dry brush over top with Gawthor Brown, and finally a feather light dry brush of Pallid Witch Flesh just to finish off the space sand and tie it together with the rubble we've painted on the scenic areas. The base itself was then decorated with grass tufts, dead leaves and clump foliage affixed to the base with PVA glue, and then the rim of the base was painted with a solid line of dryad bark. And there we have it, Saruman the White, figurehead of the legions of Isengard, ready to lead his legions into battle.